So you also talked about Isaiah 14 in your book, which was a really interesting discussion. So, people think that's Satan's fall from heaven. Could you talk about maybe what people have reasoned why people would conclude that about Isaiah 14?
Yeah. Well, the larger context of that passage is that it's a taunt speech against the king of Babylon and the demise, the death of the king of Babylon, described in a very, highly poetic way, that where the king goes down to Sheol and all the people that he's helped put there recognize him, and it's like, wow, this great king is among us. But then we get to 14:12, where there's this reference to the morning star and has fallen from heaven. And one of the reasons why there's been a connection um, to Satan in this passage is that the thought is that in the King James it says, Lucifer, son of the morning, you have fallen from heaven. And so the king is being compared to Lucifer, which is a
Mm,
name for Satan in the Bible. But actually, Lucifer is coming to us more from the Vulgate,
mm,
and it just means basically shining one and that sort of thing. Lucifer is not a name or title for the devil or Satan, or even in the Old Testament, the serpent and that sort of thing. Um, so just because there's a reference to Lucifer in some of our English translations, or that even that connection was made earlier in church history, um, I don't think the comparison here is between the king and uh, Satan.
mm,
What I would see going on is that the king is being portrayed as the shining one, son of the dawn. He's being pictured as the morning star, and this very kind of proud, arrogant, king who thinks he has godlike powers. He's at the ascent of his strength and power at this time, but he's like the morning star who appears in the highest point in the sky. But when the sun, when the sun appears or when dawn comes, he just quickly disappears. And
mm.
I think what the comparison here is that the king is being compared to the morning star, that he's going to fall. His fall from power is going to be that rapid and that quick. And this king who believes that he has godlike powers and all of those kinds of things, ultimately he's going to come to his demise. This is about a human king. It's not about the fall of Satan.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay. So, so as you see on the screen here, we have Isaiah 14:12. This is the NET translation. It says, "Look how you have fallen from the sky, O shining one, son of the dawn," as you were talking about. "You've been cut down to the ground, O conqueror of the nations." So, it's not completely clear what it's talking about, but that there's clear references to the king of Babylon, and verse 4 says, "You will taunt the king of Babylon with these words." The Another interesting comment that where the verse says is verse 13. I'll put it on the screen here. So it says, "You said to yourself, I will climb up to the sky, above the stars of El. I will set up my throne. I will rule on the mountain of Assembly, on the remote slopes of Zaphon." So, continuing, "I will climb up to the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High, but you are brought down to Sheol, to the remote slits of the pit." And it continues later. So I guess you see a lot of like, hey, this seems a lot like Satan in regards to one, Sheol, that's hell, right? And Satan's very proud, prideful, and so of course that would make sense that he would be wanting to be like the Most High. And in this passage he's like, no, that didn't happen. So you think this is in reference to a specific person, a king. And um, there's been some references that this is referring to like a something like the ball cycle, possibly. Do you see any of that in here?
Yeah, the comments that I made just a moment ago, like this is picturing the king as the morning star, and obviously the larger context is about a human king.
Mm,
But here, I think the issue then becomes with the language that you read in verse 13 and following. This seems to be like, someone that is supernatural, something that is superhuman.
uh-huh.
How could a king claim that he's going to ascend into the heavens, into the stars and the throne of God. And so in light of this, like, really exalted language, this becomes that, well, the king here is being compared to Satan when Satan fell. And again, that certainly is a possibility, but I think that probably, again, the human king is still in view, and this exalted language just reflects how incredibly arrogant and proud this ruler is.
Mm-hmm.
But again, our minds immediately go to the fall of Satan. The problem is that in the Old Testament itself, other than, unless this passage is referring to it, or maybe Ezekiel 28, where we have similar issues coming up, we don't really have a clear description of the fall of Satan. For example, the serpent in Genesis chapter 3, the Nachash, where does that serpent come from? Or, there is kind of the idea of a heavenly rebellion, and I think we can establish that, in the Old Testament again, and Dr. Heiser's work has done a lot on that.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have a clear description of the fall of the serpent or Satan. We don't really even have an equation of the serpent in Genesis with the later biblical figure Satan. So our minds, in light of the New Testament, immediately go to the fall of Satan and those kinds of things. But I think it's more likely here that, as you've already suggested, that there may be a Canaanite background to this. We have references to El, we have references to Zaphon, we have references to the Divine Assembly, all these things that kind of create. So I think instead of them thinking about the king, and we're it's in the context about a pagan king, I think in the context, this is being compared to, maybe we have examples of stories of these gods who attempt to ascend to places of power and authority, or to usurp the role that Baal has, that ultimately they weren't worthy of that. And this king is arrogant and presumptuous in that same way. And I think that's more the prototype for the story here in the historical context of the Old Testament, rather than the biblical idea of the fall of Satan. And again, we don't know which one of those stories it might be. There's a humorous story about this god, Othtar, sort of a lesser deity, that when Baal died, is sent to the underworld by Mot, he tries to take the throne of Baal, but when he sits on the throne, his feet aren't long enough to reach the floor. And so it reminds me of a little kid sitting on one of those big beach chairs, that are at the, he's not worthy of that. And I think the imagery and the Canaanite background here may go more to that than what we think of when we think of the fall of Satan, which just really isn't developed or explained or clarified that much, in the Hebrew Bible.
All right. So the NET footnote says, apparently these verses allude to a mythological story about a minor god, Hallel, son of Shakar, who tried to take over Saphon, the mountain of the gods. His attempted coup failed, and he was hurled down to the underworld. The king of Babylon is taunted for having similar unrealized illusions of grandeur. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there are references to, like, the dawn and things like that being gods in Canaanite mythology. So again, now, so I think in a more biblical theological way, can we make a connection to Satan here? Obviously, like, these pretentious, arrogant gods are ultimately they're a reflection of the fallen sons of God and that sort of thing. We know from later revelation that it was pride and arrogance that led to the fall of Satan. We know that, in the New Testament, Satan and the serpent are equated to each other. That connection is made. And we know, I think, even from the Old Testament itself, that the nations of the earth and the kings of the nations, and they're under the control of the fallen sons of God. So in a sense, Satan is the hand in the glove. But so in that biblical theological sense, the arrogance of this king of Babylon certainly is related to the fall of Satan. But even with New Testament passages that talk about the fall of Satan, that's not something that happened with the original fall. It's often things that are depicted in connection with the ministry of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, or it's a battle that takes place in heaven in Revelation chapter 12. But it's not necessarily going back. Like, where did the serpent come from?
Hmm.
The Old Testament itself just doesn't answer that question.
Hmm. So it's okay if you're not prepared to answer this question, but a number of people in the comments were
There's
saying
been a
that,
few of those that I'm
yeah. So there's never people in the comments that are mentioning like, hey, you have almost a similar theme of like, I guess a person that's portrayed as a bad figure, and a lot of these times they are connected with Satan. So like a lot of times people connect Satan with Isaiah in this passage, as well as like Ezekiel in Ezekiel 28, and I guess maybe there's an idea like, hey, there's some similar ideas, so maybe they're referring to the same person, and maybe they're not called Satan specifically, but maybe they represent Satan, or they are Satan but just using different words. Do you have any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, I think kind of in terms of, again, if I look at this from a more biblical theological perspective, I think Satan is the ultimate reality. Like, we have all these passages in, or like Isaiah 27:1 that talks about Leviathan being crushed and all those kinds of,
Sure.
like, we know as Christians that the ultimate reality behind that serpent is, the Satan and the powers of evil. But again, just all of those dots are not necessarily, even the idea that Satan is the leader of the powers and forces of evil and those kinds of things. The Old Testament doesn't make those connections. We don't have, we only have really a handful of references to Satan in the Old Testament, and most of those, except for one, he's the Satan. It's a title. It's not necessarily a name. So even when you get back to Job 1 and 2, and you have the Satan there appearing, but along with the sons of God, there's even discussion and debate about, well, who exactly is this figure? Is he to be connected with the later Satan, which I think he is, or is he merely, God's private investigator who's part of
Hmm.
the sons of God and those kinds of? So I think, in an ultimate sense, like the powers of evil and all of that, there's connections here that can be made to Satan, but I think it's secondary to the actual message. That's not necessarily in the thinking or in the mind of Isaiah as he's developing this image.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
so, and
Hmm.
the passage over in his the closest parallel to this is obviously the passage about Ezekiel chapter 28, which also is a passage about the king of Tyre and the death of this human who thinks that he's like God. And I think the references there, Dan Block and others have developed this. I think the references there to whatever figure is there in the garden that he's being compared to, I think it's more likely that Adam is the prototype behind that,
Hmm.
rather than Satan himself.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So you said a lot there. Specifically, I wanted to ask you about is, so you think that someone like this king that's mentioned in Isaiah 14, it's not specifically talking about Satan, but you'd say that it is maybe Satan is the evil figure, like, I don't know, representing him or giving that king power. Is that how you would put it?
Right. Right. That we can see ultimately that Satan is the one behind this figure, and those connections are fairly easy to make in light of both really Old and New Testament revelation. It would be very similar to, like, in Daniel, where you have the prince of Persia and the prince of Egypt, or the prince of Greece, that obviously are not, these are not royal, these are not human kings. They're talking about angelic powers and that sort of thing. And so the fallen sons of God are definitely behind these human rulers and that sort
Uh-huh.
of thing. And Babylon itself, in the Bible, going all the way back to Genesis 11, and then you go, fast forward into the New Testament to the end, Babylon represents the center of opposition to God. So obviously, some sort of ultimate connection to Satan, makes sense to me.
Hmm. Awesome. All right. So was there anything else you wanted to add about that?
I think I think I've exhausted, what I could possibly say there.